My concern, my sole concern, is what is going to deliver a better consumer experience in the digital age. And I truly believe that removing some of these regulations that are impeding IP-based investment, and getting rid of some of these antiquated regulations, is the best way to promote competition, promote consumer welfare, not these sort of over-the-top, 80-year-old regulations that have been proven not to work.
Hi, I'm Nick Gillespie with Reason TV, and today we're talking with FCC Commissioner Ajit Pai. He is a proponent of an open internet, but not net neutrality. Ajit, thanks for talking to us.
Nick, it is great to be with you.
Recently, the FCC Chairman, Tom Wheeler, said that he's going to move forward with the FCC regulating the internet under Title II regulations. That'll change the regulatory structure from that of an information service to a telecom. What is the most important thing that people need to know about that switch?
I think the most important thing that people need to know is that this is a solution that won't work to a problem that simply doesn't exist. And let me tackle the latter part of that initially. Nowhere in the 332-page document that I've received will anyone find the FCC detailing any kind of systemic harm to consumers. And it seems to me that should be the predicate for
any
certainly
kind of
preemptive regulation, some kind of systemic problem that requires an industry-wide solution. But that simply isn't here.
So, I mean, you're saying the internet is not broken?
I don't think it is. No, I think by and large people are able to access the lawful content of their choice. And while competition isn't where we want it to be, we can always have more choices, better speeds, lower prices, et cetera. Nonetheless, if you look at the metrics compared to, say, Europe, which has a utility-style regulatory approach, I think we're doing pretty well.
What can we say about how many, one of the things that people say, well, we need to regulate the internet because local ISP, internet service providers like Time Warner or Comcast, or what have you, they have an effective local monopoly on service. Is that accurate? And would that be enough of a reason to say, yeah, we got to do something?
I certainly think there are a lot of markets where consumers want and could use more competition. And that's why, since I've become a commissioner, I've focused on getting rid of some of the regulatory underbrush that stands in the way of some upstart competitors providing that alternative. Streamlining local permitting rules, getting more wireless infrastructure out there to give a mobile alternative, making sure we have enough spectrum in the commercial marketplace. But these kinds of Title II common carrier regulations, ironically, will be completely counterproductive. It's going to sweep a lot of these smaller providers away. They simply don't have the ability to comply with all these regulations. And moreover, it's going to deter investment in broadband networks. And so, ironically enough, this hypothetical problem that people are worried about is going to become worse because of the lack of competition.
But you're also saying it doesn't exist. So, I mean, do most people in America have, choice in broadband carriers, and do they have more choice than they had, say, 5 years ago? And is there a reason to believe that they'll have even more choice in another 5 years?
I think while there are hiccups that any given consumer might experience in any given market, nonetheless, if you look on the aggregate, Americans are much better off than they were 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Speeds are increasing, the amount of choice is increasing. Something like 76% of Americans have access to 3 or more facilities-based providers. So over 80% of Americans have access to 25 megabit per second speeds. In terms of the mobile equation, part of the equation, there's no question that America has made tremendous strides. 86% of Americans now have access to 4G LTE. We have 50% of the world's LTE subscribers, yet only 4% of the population.
So now a lot of people will say, though, that part of the problem is that Europe, for instance, is so much more advanced than we are in terms of the speed of connectivity, the price of a connection, and the variety. Is that just wrong?
That is wrong. If you look at the Akamai State of the Internet report, for example, or other objective data, there's no question that America is better off, especially considering a relatively lower population density in terms of deployment, speeds, prices, whatever metric you choose. Moreover, if you look at investment in the United States is $562 per household. In Europe, it's only $244.
Why is that important?
I think it's important because the key is we want to have a strong enough platform for innovation, investment, and online options as possible. But you won't get that if the private sector doesn't have the incentive to risk capital to build those networks. I mean, it's a pretty tough thing to build the nuts and bolts of the internet. And if the regulatory system is one that second guesses you every single step of the way, regulates your rates, tells you what service plans are allowed or not, regulates the commercial arrangements you have both with end users and companies, you're going to be in a situation where you will have the European situation.
I don't know if he counts as your boss, but the head of the FCC says Tom Wheeler says, no, we're going to place the internet under Title II, but we're going to use a light touch. And his predecessor, Julius Janikowski, also talked about that. And we're going to do a lot of forbearance. What is the forbearance process and how would it actually work?
Forbearance is a process that was set up by Congress in 1996 to allow the FCC not to enforce a particular statute or regulation if it determined that that statute or regulation was no longer necessary to enforce in the public interest. And essentially, over the years, the FCC has said, if a particular aspect of the marketplace is competitive, then we won't enforce regulations relating to it. But think about the weird jujitsu that the FCC will have to do in this context. On one hand, on a macro level, it's going to have to say that the broadband internet access market is so uncompetitive that we need preemptive, sweeping regulations along the lines of Title II. On the other hand, it's going to have to say the marketplace is competitive enough that we don't need to enforce a lot of these different regulations. That's a conceptual problem that I don't think the proposal does a good job of addressing.
You've talked about the proposal as being well over 300 pages. There have been accounts that that's mostly footnotes and addenda, and that actually the rules are about 8 or 10 pages. Is that accurate?
The rules are 8 pages. However, the details with respect to forbearance, the regulations from which we will not be taking action, that is alone is 79 pages. Moreover, sprinkled throughout the document, there are uncodified rules that won't make it into the Code of Federal Regulations that people will have to comply with in the private sector. On top of that, there are things that aren't going to be codified, such as the Internet Conduct Standard, where the FCC will essentially say that it has carte blanche to decide what kinds of practices and service plans are legitimate and which are not. And the FCC sort of hints at what factors it might consider in making that determination.
What goes into something like that, where you're saying, okay, we're the regulators and we're here now and you got to pay attention to us, but we're not going to actually tell you what you need to do? Is that, I mean, that's passive aggressive, to the max. But I mean, is that a decided strategy to say we want you to jump, but we're not going to tell you how high?
I think part of the problem is that the rules themselves don't give sufficient guidance to the private sector, regardless of whether they're public or not. And part of the reason why I want them to be public soon, in advance of the vote, is that I think the American public, and particularly the people who'd be affected by it, deserve to see what regulations are going to be adopted before they're formally adopted.
I mean, we will eventually get to read the document, but right. This question of the secrecy of the document, where somebody, I mean, it's maybe this is a bridge too far, but it's almost McCarthyite, where we've got these regulations and they're going to affect you and you'll get to read them eventually. Why wouldn't the FCC just put the document out into the public when it was announced that it's going to be voted on? What is the history of kind of the secrecy of rulemaking or documentation in the FCC, and does this represent a break with that?
Under the rules, only the chairman has the authority to disclose this document, and he has said both to Congress and to the public that he's not going to do so. And he has cited the traditional practice of the FCC, which is to not reveal these proposals until after they are voted on. And he's absolutely right. That is the traditional practice. However,
is that a good practice?
Well, I think in this case it absolutely is not. If you look at how great the public interest is in this issue, the folks who have been advocating for net neutrality have told us repeatedly that the internet is something unique among the FCC's responsibilities, that 4 million people have commented, that the president himself has made specific comments about it. And so I think if ever we were to make an exception to the traditional practice, this is it. Moreover, it's not that big of a leap to say that the FCC should be as open and transparent as the internet itself. Simply publish the rules, let the American people see it, and I think they can make up their own minds. Now, one of the additional arguments that has been made is that we need to keep this document confidential so that various commissioners can suggest changes, et cetera. But by and large, I don't think it's a big surprise as to how the vote is going to come on February 26th. And to the extent that that was the concern, I think it's misplaced. I think we should just get the document out there, let the American public have input, especially to the extent that this wasn't our proposal in the spring and it wasn't our proposal in the summer. This came at the insistence, essentially, of the White House, which, as I said, to this day, is asking the FCC to implement the president's plan.
What will the vote be? What's your prediction?
Most astute observers suggest that it will be 3-2 with the 3 Democrats in the majority and the 2 Republicans, myself included, in the minority.
You've criticized the proposal, for not being public. Will it become public, or when will it become public, and when will there be a kind of commenting period that goes into effect?
The FCC will vote on February 26th on this proposal. At that point, the document could be released at any time. Now, given the sheer breadth of this document, as well as what I would expect to be my dissent and at least one of my colleagues' dissents, then typically the majority takes time to respond to our arguments, and there's a back and forth between the majority and the minority. That takes, in some cases, weeks to iron out. So we could be well into March before this document gets
out to the
light of day.
There's also a question of what happens next, because I'm assuming that all of the ISPs, or at least some, will sue to say this is another example of the FCC trying to assert authority or jurisdiction when it doesn't have any. That's a foregone conclusion. What does that suggest that they should have used a legislative, that Congress is the person or is the body that should be writing these rules?
I think so, absolutely. When the Verizon versus FCC decision came out a year ago, without knowing we would end up here, I said, at this point, the FCC has now been struck down twice by the courts in its attempts to adopt internet regulations. The time has come for us to seek congressional guidance. We are trying to fit what some can consider to be a square peg of regulation into this round hole of the Communications Act, which, as you pointed out, is over 8 decades old. So
what role did the White House play in enforcing this decision?
I think the White House changed the landscape dramatically with the president's announcement shortly after the midterm elections that he wanted the FCC to adopt Title II regulations and said, and it's still on his website, I asked the FCC to implement this plan.
And now the FCC is technically an independent agency, right?
It is, and always has been.
Does that cross any lines, or and is it different? Is it a break with past protocols of the president kind of demanding certain things?
It is a break in my experience. I've served under a number of different chairmen during administrations of Republican and Democratic affiliation. I've never seen anything as high profile as this. There have been other examples of presidents weighing in with a letter or a phone call, that kind of thing. But splashy YouTube video, a website with very specific prescriptions as to what this agency should do, followed by the agency suddenly changing course from where it was to mimic the president's plan, I think suggests that the independence of the agency has been compromised to some extent.
How will we know if Title II is successful, say 10, 15, 20 years out?
I think we'll have to use as objective a metric as we can to measure such things as broadband availability, especially in areas of this country that are harder to serve. I think we'll have to look at prices to see whether they've increased or not, and this plan in particular opens the door to billions of dollars in new fees being added to people's broadband bills.
Why does it do that?
Because if you look at your phone bill and you'll see a line item that says universal service fee, that applies only to your voice service right now. By treating broadband internet access as essentially telephone service, the FCC explicitly opens the door in this document to the assessment of universal service fees on the federal and state level.
Now, I'm assuming that also, that proponents are saying, no, that's part of the forbearance. We won't actually insist on that. So, is that accurate, or is it just that the problem is that there are few cases where the government grants itself power and then doesn't eventually start exercising it?
If you were able to see this document, which you are not, you would see that it explicitly says that in a few months we, the FCC, are expected to get a recommendation on how to consider broadband for purposes of this Universal Service Fund fee program. Given the trajectory of the Universal Service Fund policies from the Lifeline program to what is called E-rate, et cetera, the agency is spending billions of dollars and is looking to expand it even further. It's impossible for us to spend money from the Universal Service Fund on these programs without including contributions from the providers, and essentially fees based on broadband connections.
Wireless voice has been regulated under Title II for some time now, right?
Wireless voice has, wireless data has not.
But does wireless voice give us any indication of whether or not Title II will be a real heavy millstone, or does it show that being regulated under Title II reduces or retards innovation, or what's the experience there?
Wireless voice, if you look at the data prior to the introduction of the smartphone, Wireless voice essentially was a commodity that you didn't see a lot of innovation in that space, a lot of investment for obvious reasons. It's not something that carriers were spending a lot of time thinking about and investing in. But once mobile data use started to explode with the introduction of the iPhone in 2007, all of a sudden you saw carriers scrambling to upgrade their networks, to spend more money on spectrum, to deliver some of those high bandwidth applications and so forth. And so this argument that wireless voice, having been regulated as Title II, has been a success, and so we can do the same for mobile data, it's absurd on its face.
Net neutrality, everybody says they want a free and open internet, and by that generally, what are the points of agreement, and then when does it get fuzzy?
I think former Chairman Powell put it best when he said in 2004 that there were 4 basic internet freedoms that he thought everyone should agree with. The freedom to access lawful content of one's choice, the freedom to access applications that don't harm the network, the freedom to attach devices to the network, and the freedom to get information about your service plan. Everybody agrees on that, or virtually everybody. I certainly do. But the question is, how do we operationalize that? And in my view, the federal government is a pretty poor arbiter of what is reasonable and what is not, and it's exceptionally poor when it comes to having a track record of promoting innovation and investment in broadband networks. That's something the private sector has done a remarkable job on its own.
What are the instances that net neutrality proponents can point to, where ISPs or other network operators have actually abrogated those open net principles?
There are scattered examples that people often cite. An ISP no one's ever heard of called Madison River, almost a decade ago. Some have targeted Metro PCS, which was acquired by T-Mobile. Its crime was...
Yeah, talk a little bit about that, because that's a fascinating example.
It is. So Metro PCS, of course, upstart competitor, had virtually no market power to speak of compared to the big carriers, wanted to make a splash in the marketplace, and so it offered its consumers virtually unlimited data plans for $40. So you could stream YouTube, for example, without it counting against your data cap, all for $40. And net neutrality...
but it was basically you could only stream YouTube videos, right?
Exactly.
I mean, the rest of the web you really couldn't get on it.
Exactly, and so critics called it a net neutrality violation, said that this was a walled garden that was bad for consumers, and it is telling that they didn't go after one of the major incumbents that now they complain about vociferously. They went after an upstart competitor.
So it's somebody who was saying, okay, we're going to give you we're going to give you less for less, but if you want it, you can have it.
You either have to eat at an all-you-can-eat restaurant, or you don't get to eat at all.
Right. I mean, that's the idea of net neutrality.
Essentially, yeah.
What do you think are the main drivers behind net neutrality? Because, I mean, from my perspective, when I look at things from a kind of public choice economics idea, what I tend to see are companies like Netflix, Amazon, to a certain degree Google, eBay, other players who are very big and have done very well with the way that the internet works now, and they kind of want to freeze everything in place. And this, to me, it seems a lot like the robber barons who were, when railroads were starting to be regulated, they were like, great, let's regulate things and fix our market shares or our market positions. Is that wrong to think of it in those terms?
I certainly think there are particular companies that might see strategic advantage in having the FCC inject itself for the first time into the nuts and bolts of the internet's operation. I mean, for example, regulating the rates and terms on which ISPs and edge providers have to interconnect. I mean, that's something that, if you're not getting what you think is a good deal through private commercial agreements, it might be helpful to have an FCC backstop. I think there are a lot of other people, smaller entrepreneurs and innovators that we hear from, that are worried that ISPs might end up acting as gatekeepers and keeping their content off the web. And while I understand their concern, I nonetheless think that, number one, there is no existing, as I said, systemic example of that. But number two, to the extent there were, then the way to solve that is through case-by-case adjudication using, say, the antitrust laws or Federal Trade Commission authority or even FCC authority to the extent we have it. It is not imposing Title II regulations, which ultimately and ironically are going to limit the progress of this online platform. I mean, I think all these startups and innovators are based here for a reason. It's because we have the best internet infrastructure in the world. But that network doesn't have to exist. People don't have to invest in it. And ultimately, this could be counterproductive for them too.
You've called out Netflix in particular, which has probably been the most vocal proponent of net neutrality and of Title II regulation as well. They came up, or they apparently have a system where the way that they code some of their streams, they gain an advantage on existing networks by the way that they code it, that they've created a fast lane on today's internet. Why would that be wrong?
So to be clear, I don't think that Netflix should be subject to regulation, but when it came to this question, we heard an allegation in the fall from people who are pushing open video standards, everyone from ISPs to Level 3 and Limelight and the like. And they wanted to create a system in which essentially traffic would be recognized as being video traffic, and then you could optimize the network to deliver it more efficiently, better experience for the end user. Netflix, we heard, was encrypting some of that traffic to make it difficult, if not impossible, for that traffic to be recognized as video traffic. And so I simply asked them, what's the gist of your response to these allegations? In particular, allegations that they had done encryption selectively, and they had picked in particular encryption against the ISPs that were using open video standards before using encryption against.
So that they were kind of sliding by without having to stay in the same line that all other video was.
Right, exactly. And if the interest is truly in a free and open internet, then one could make the argument that what the company is arguing for when it comes to ISP behavior should apply equally to edge provider behavior.
How did they respond?
Well, they responded that they deployed encryption to preserve the privacy of their customers, that they didn't deploy it selectively, and that in any case there wasn't any ongoing FCC proceedings, so there wasn't really any reason for them to respond further.
Netflix was also involved in a kind of large battle. It's not quite net neutrality, but it's peering, where they were saying basically that Comcast in particular and a couple of other large ISPs, that customers were suffering through extended buffering times where the quality of the stream and the reliability wasn't so good. The ISP said, look, Netflix is generating a huge amount of traffic, and we need to build out our network in order to handle this traffic and prioritize it. And Comcast in particular, they have a new deal with Netflix where Netflix basically pays them more so that they get a faster pipe into the ISP. Is that the way the system should work? Is that a good outcome? Is that a bad outcome? What do you think?
So from a procedural standpoint, neither of those parties ever filed a formal complaint with us, so we don't have what you might consider objective evidence from the parties as to what exactly the nitty-gritty of the situation was. So all I can say is based on what I've read in the press. But that said, I think the nature of the dispute illustrates the folly of involving the government in refereeing some of those disputes. In real time, we simply don't have the ability to determine who is right and who is wrong, I don't think, even if we had the legal authority to do it, which I don't necessarily think we do. But ultimately, by and large, if you look at the end result, these arrangements, which have been commercially reasonable, at least according to both parties, given that they signed it, have been good for consumers. And if there's some kind of systemic problem when it comes to peering and transit and other kinds of interconnection, then I'm certainly willing to have an open mind about it. But I think in the absence of that, we should let the commercial arrangements work themselves out. And
it's funny when you say that it's been good for consumers. I guess that gets lost in a lot of this, right? Where we're talking about this as it's a battle between Comcast and Netflix, or this company and that company, but ultimately the measure of all kind of economic regulation and certainly antitrust type of law is how it affects the consumer. And that Netflix has to pay more to deliver its service, or the ISP has to eat more costs, that's not the same thing as saying the customer is in a bad position.
Exactly, and I'm an antitrust lawyer by training, and that's why I view everything through the prism of consumer welfare. And that's why I find it amusing when some of my critics say that, oh, you're just shilling for the big ISPs or looking out for big business. At the end of the day, my sole concern is what is going to deliver a better consumer experience in the digital age. And I truly believe that removing some of these regulations that are impeding IP-based investment, and getting rid of some of these antiquated regulations is the best way to promote competition, promote consumer welfare, not these sort of over-the-top, 80-year-old regulations that have been proven not to work.
Mark Cuban recently said that, come out at a tech conference, he said, come on, letting the FCC do Title II or net neutrality rules, the government will fuck everything up. Do you agree with that?
Well, as an FCC regulator, I certainly can't say that I agree with his use of one of the 7 dirty words. What I will say, however, is that the gist of his sentiment is absolutely right. I mean, do you trust the federal government to make the internet ecosystem more vibrant than it is today? Can you think of any regulated utility, like the electric company or water company, that is as innovative as the internet? I mean, I think what Mark Andreessen, who developed, of course, the first Netscape browser, what he and other entrepreneurs are seeing is that this is something that has worked really well, and there's no reason for the FCC to mess it up by inserting itself into areas where it hasn't been before.
You've also been critical of the idea that if the federal government or the U.S. government gets involved in the regulation of our internet, that sends a particular message to other countries. That's not particularly good. Explain what you mean by that.
I think that also on the international stage, there is an effort at the International Telecommunications Union, which is an arm of the United Nations, and another for the current model of internet governance, which has been multi-stakeholder, decentralized, to be changed. And a lot of foreign governments, especially repressive governments, would love nothing more than to have more direct control over both the infrastructure of the internet and the content that rides over those networks. The United States, to its credit, has spoken with a single voice against such efforts. But I think that to the extent that Title II is the approach we take and the FCC starts to micromanage those same nuts and bolts of the network, it becomes harder for us on the international stage to make that case, to persuade other countries not to go down the same road. And I would note that this is exactly the same position the Obama administration itself took in 2009 and 2010, when one of our ambassadors at the State Department said specifically that he was concerned that Title II style regulation would send a negative message to repressive governments and would lead them to block or otherwise degrade certain kinds of internet traffic.
Is it time for us to grow up and just say, you know what, the content regulation that was put into place for broadcast material, whether it's radio or TV, we should just get rid of that?
I think that's one of the things we've heard from people who say that the times have changed since the days of Pacifica back in the 70s. On the other hand, we also hear from a number of different people who say that a lot of folks who still rely on over-the-air broadcasting count on that medium being safe for kids within that window of time. So those are the balancing considerations we're going to have to figure out. But there's no question that it's one of the challenging issues that, especially given the legal context, is difficult to manage.
Also the other thing that was huge then had to do with ownership rules and concentration, media concentration. We have a company like Comcast that Comcast and NBC are together. Comcast and Time Warner are merging, et cetera. But you don't hear the same fears really that you did a decade ago or 20 years ago that 2 or 3 corporations own all of the media. Is there a reason, have we moved past that once and for all, or is there a reason to be worried about, say, a company like Comcast, becoming a major deliverer of content as well as a major content provider, as well as politically a huge player?
I've been very outspoken in my opposition to the media ownership rules, which in some cases have remained unaltered since 1975. And I think that outside of major markets, but even in some of the major markets, you see newspapers shuttering, you see radio stations struggling, you see TV broadcasters finding it more difficult to do the hard legwork of gathering local news and distributing it. And I think in that context, it's incumbent upon the agency to modernize its regulations to recognize that cross-ownership has some virtues. If you have a radio station and a newspaper that can collaborate and distribute the news over multiple platforms, that makes a lot of financial sense, and it's good for the consumer at the end of the day. And so, it's been over 8 years now, or almost 8 years since we last looked at this.
Even if the same person, let's say Lady Bird Johnson, owned all the TV stations and all the radio stations in Austin, Texas, you would still be able to get a wide variety of news.
Absolutely, and I think about my own news consumption. I'm a very active user of Twitter, and I use that more or less as news curation. And so, I get a lot of my news through links that I find on Twitter, especially to Reason.com.
Well, thank you. Here's hoping it stays bright, right? But talk a little bit about your kind of ideological genealogy. Where do your ideas come from? You're obviously very pro-free market. You mentioned you're an antitrust lawyer by training. You're a Republican appointee by Obama. So, what are the ideas that motivate your thinking process in terms of regulation?
I think going back to college at Harvard and then law school at the University of Chicago, I was exposed to a view of the world through the lens of economics that recognize that when government is relatively restrained in terms of its intervention in the economy, there is unbounded possibility for the consumer or the citizen. And that's why I've been outspoken since I've been at the FCC in favor of policies that I think will get the government out of the equation to the extent necessary to allow innovation to flourish. And I think there's no question that capitalism, generally speaking, has been the greatest source of human benefit, much greater than any government program that's ever been designed. If you look at how many people have been lifted out of poverty through free market ideas, it's tremendous. And it's that kind of innovation I think people often take for granted because we live naturally in the moment, and so it's hard to see the sweep of history. But I can tell you, for people as old as me, I remember 20 years ago when the internet was at its inception. It was hard to get news. It was hard to take, do certain things that we now take for granted on a smartphone. But now, thanks to people in the private sector taking the risk, investing the capital, and being able to count on a regulatory system that didn't micromanage them, that's delivered unparalleled consumer value.
How did you ever get appointed under Obama?
I guess I slipped through, but no, I think I was recommended by Senator Mitch McConnell for one of the Republican positions, and by tradition, Senate minority leadership gets a fair degree of deference, and I was fortunate to get the president's agreement as well.
Do you have any sense of what the internet will look like in 20 years?
My wife sometimes thinks I'm crazy when I say this, but it's not inconceivable that we would see a future in which people have chips embedded in their arms which contain all sorts of information, that they're able to connect wirelessly using those chips to all kinds of services and applications, from healthcare to e-commerce. The car is going to be incredibly connected in ways that might obviate the need for active management of the car. I think the Internet of Things, in short, is going to be tremendous, and I think that's something that, both as a consumer and as a former commissioner, I guess I'll be at that time, I can't wait to see.
We'll leave it there. Thanks so much for talking to us. We've been talking with Ajit Pai of the FCC. For Reason TV, I'm Nick Gillespie. Because local ISP, internet service providers like Time Warner or Comcast or what have you, they have an effective local monopoly on service. Is that accurate? And would that be enough of a reason to say, yeah, we got to do something?
I certainly think there are a lot of markets where consumers want and could use more competition. And that's why, since I've become a commissioner, I focused on getting rid of some of the regulatory underbrush that stands in the way of some upstart competitors providing that alternative. Streamlining local permitting rules, getting more wireless infrastructure out there to give a mobile alternative, making sure we have enough spectrum in the commercial marketplace. But these kinds of Title II common carrier detailing any kind of systemic harm to consumers. And it seems to me that should be the predicate for
any
certainly
kind of
preemptive regulation, some kind of systemic problem that requires an industry-wide solution. But that simply isn't here.
So, I mean, you're saying the internet is not broken?
I don't think it is. No, I think by and large people are able to access the lawful content of their choice. And while competition isn't where we want it to be, we can always have more choices, better speeds, lower prices, et cetera. Nonetheless, if you look at the metrics compared to, say, Europe, which has a utility-style regulatory approach, I think we're doing pretty well.
What can we say about how many, one of the things that people say, well, we need to regulate the internet.
Regulations, ironically, will be completely counterproductive. It's going to sweep a lot of these smaller providers away. They simply don't have the ability to comply with all these regulations. And moreover, it's going to deter investment in broadband networks. And so, ironically enough, this hypothetical problem that people are worried about is going to become worse because of the lack of competition.
But you're also saying it doesn't exist. So, I mean, do most people in America have, choice in broadband carriers, and do they have more choice than they had, say, 5 years ago? And is there a reason to believe that they'll have even more choice in another 5 years?
I think while there are hiccups that any given consumer might, my sole concern is what is going to deliver a better consumer experience in the digital age. And I truly believe that removing some of these regulations that are impeding IP-based investment, and getting rid of some of these antiquated regulations is the best way to promote competition, promote consumer welfare, not these sort of over-the-top, 80-year-old regulations that have been proven not to work.
Hi, I'm Nick Gillespie with Reason TV, and today we're talking with FCC Commissioner Ajit Pai. He is a proponent of an open internet, but not net neutrality. Ajit, thanks for talking to us.
Nick, it is great to be with you.
Recently, the FCC Chairman, Tom Wheeler, said that he's going to move forward with the FCC regulating the internet under Title II regulations. And that'll change the regulatory structure from that of an information service to a telecom. What is the most important thing that people need to know about that switch?
I think the most important thing that people need to know is that this is a solution that won't work to a problem that simply doesn't exist. And let me tackle the latter part of that initially. Nowhere in the 332-page document that I've received will anyone find the FCC